For those of you with a keen eye, you may have noticed an unusual red vehicle lurking in the background of some videos and photos of Chernobyl. This is no fire engine nor a vehicle of any Soviet model. It is, in fact, a Mercedes Benz truck that, through an unlucky series of events, found itself inside Chernobyl Unit 4 during the explosion. This is the story of the battle to save this vehicle and the mystery of its ultimate fate. This tale has two beginnings on opposite sides of the Iron Curtain. Let's first delve into the eastern side, where the story takes root in familiar territory. As many know, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant consisted of 4 operating units before the 1986 disaster, launched from 1979 to 1983. Connected to these reactors were the 8 turbines in the turbine hall, 2 for each reactor, all built by the Kharkiv turbine plant in eastern Ukraine. Units 1 and 2, the first to be launched, were fitted with K500-65/3000 turbines. These turbines were very new to the energy production world, but they proved to be incredibly successful, even awarded the State Prize of Ukraine in 1979. However, these turbines were relatively expensive to build, prompting the Kharkiv turbine plant to modify the structure to reduce the amount of metal used. These resulting models, the K500-65/3000-2, were not as structurally stable as their predecessors and could begin to vibrate on the bearings that supported them, even due to small changes in operating conditions. The easiest way to fix this was to rebalance the turbine to stop the vibrations, but this required measuring the intensity of vibration throughout the turbine at different stages of operation. It would only be a temporary fix, as the balance of the turbine would eventually slip once more. The solution: the Kharkiv turbine plant sent a group of specialists in mobile laboratories around the Soviet Union, visiting places that needed turbine adjustments to ensure they were corrected. For a specialist, precise equipment is essential, and for that, we journey from Ukraine to West Germany, where Mercedes Benz was headquartered. It would have been just another chassis for the company, specifically of the LK class, but this vehicle was about to embark on a journey unlike any other. The vehicle was purchased by the company Vibrometer in Switzerland, and a mobile laboratory that could precisely measure the vibrations of a turbine was mounted onto the chassis. At the end of 1985, this vehicle was then purchased by the Kharkiv turbine plant for their specialists. Inside, this was a luxury they could never have imagined before. Access to Western equipment like this seldom occurred, being far superior to anything the Soviets had produced thus far, not to mention how expensive they all knew this must have been. They took great care of this truck, beyond anything else. And so it was for the next 4 or so months, the vehicle roamed the Soviet Union to diagnose turbine issues and ensure they were corrected. This continued until April 17, 1986. As the date suggests, we are approaching the scheduled shutdown of Unit 4 on April 25th. This shutdown was to allow for repairs to some equipment in Unit 4, including turbines 7 and 8, which were beginning to suffer from the vibration problems mentioned earlier. The Kharkiv turbine plant had previously assisted Chernobyl when turbine 5, connected to reactor 3, began to vibrate. So the chief engineer, Nikolai Fomin, sent a letter to the Kharkiv turbine plant asking them to send a mobile laboratory to Unit 4 to measure the vibrations and solve the problem. The turbine plant obliged, and the mobile laboratory was sent to Unit 4 with a crew of 4: Kabinov, Stav, Vov, and Popov. Of course, to reach the turbines for the measurements, they could not simply park their vehicle outside the building. So they drove it into the turbine hall through a network of rail lines inside the building called the transport corridor. The Mercedes was now inside the building and would soon witness an apocalypse. For now, the Mercedes truck worked in the turbine hall, connected to a series of sensors on turbines 7 and 8, monitoring the vibration of the turbines at different loads, or how much steam is flowing through the turbine. This caused quite a bit of interference during the turbine rundown program, the experiment that everyone is familiar with at Unit 4, as they were trying to run the vibration measurements simultaneously. Alas, the crew of 4 in the Mercedes were waiting, analyzing data in the mobile laboratory, when they heard a tremendous boom from outside. We all know what this was: the explosion inside the reactor core of Unit 4 that tore the building apart, including the collapse of the roof of the turbine hall above turbine 7. Suddenly, the Mercedes truck and its crew found themselves in a battle to survive a nuclear disaster. The crew's top priority was not to escape the building, but to save the Mercedes truck from the inferno. They first went outside to assess the damage, leaving through the transport corridor again and walking straight up to the debris pile. This ultimately resulted in the deaths of SOV and Popov due to high radiation exposure. Even worse, their deaths were concealed by the Soviet government, which admitted only 28 deaths due to the explosion in 1986. The four men returned to the Mercedes and hid, with their intact lighting and air conditioning systems ironically making the truck the most normal and comfortable place in all of Unit 4. Unlike the door, most of the time, the likes of Razum and David Bayer visited and tried to convince the four men to abandon their truck, but they refused. Then it was the turn of Palchik, who had been in the control room during the explosion, who at least told them to seek the outdoors. This leads to an interesting exchange between Khabinov and Dyatlov. Khabinov approached Dyatlov in the control room with two of his men and explained that they at least wanted to help. But Dyatlov explicitly ordered them to leave the unit. But Khabinov wouldn't relent and spent about 30 seconds explaining to Dyatlov how important the Mercedes was. With Dyatlov's frustration building, he eventually snapped, "Damn it! To hell with that machine! Get out of the unit now!" The four men remained in the truck for some time. However, they inevitably began to exhibit symptoms of radiation poisoning. A lot of nuclear fuel and graphite had crashed into the turbine hall, including some core elements that were pulverized to dust. These rained down on the truck, and of course, a piece of fuel tangled on wires connected to a transformer outside the building aimed a concentrated beam of radiation into the building. One by one, the Kharkiv turbine plant specialists fell ill and had to be evacuated. Now, the Mercedes truck lay abandoned in the turbine hall. The fires had been extinguished, and now the attention turned to cleaning up the mess. The Mercedes truck, still abandoned in the turbine hall, was proving an annoyance because it was in the way of the cleanup. The engine still worked, and the vehicle still had fuel, so some liquidators decided to move it. Not out the side door, of course. There was a trench dug next to the turbine hall for electrical work on April 25th, which would strand the vehicle if they did so. Instead, they drove it through the transport corridors again and back out through the door it came in. And so, the vehicle was now left parked next to the hydrogen production building, just a few dozen meters away from Unit 4 and the debris pile. There it remained for some time, a mere spectator of the events, such as when an IMR-1 vehicle was sent in to cut the hydrogen pipelines adjacent to the vehicle to prevent hydrogen from accumulating in the turbine hall. The outer border of the sarcophagus was installed, and the Mercedes remained close by. It was only when the buttress walls of the sarcophagus were being raised, and with it the ground around Unit 4, that the Mercedes became under threat of being buried. So instead, it was driven to the industrial site next to Unit 4, where it remains hidden in various photos. SOV and Popov, two of the crew for the Mercedes truck, would eventually succumb to the radiation exposure they received on May 21st and June 23rd, respectively. SOV, his appearance completely destroyed by radiation, would give an interview explaining his condition, immortalized on record as part of a Ministry of Defense video, talking about how he went to the destroyed tanks, likely stepping too close to nuclear fuel or graphite on the ground. Khabinov and Stav returned to the Kharkiv turbine plant, but were disabled and unable to work the same again. But what of the truck? This is where the mystery begins. There were plans to rename the Mercedes after the two men who died and send it back into use touring the USSR to measure turbines. But Stav, one of the occupants, was informed in 1987 that they could not guarantee complete decontamination, and instead, the vehicle was to remain in the exclusion zone. If it is still there, it was never seen at any of the vehicle graveyards. Given it remained at a nuclear power plant until possibly as late as the end of September, while many of these burial sites filled up, it might still be hidden close to the nuclear power plant or lost in the forests of the exclusion zone. But there is an alternative theory based on events written by Piers Paul Reed in the book Ablaze that Stav was not aware of. According to Reed, the vehicle was towed away by two IMR-1 vehicles by the KGB, who claimed they wanted to analyze the vibration measurements of the turbine to determine the cause of the disaster. This removal was very high profile. One of the IMR-1s was manned by the legendary General Vladimir Pikolov, who had been on site at Chernobyl since April 26th, and the other by General Fedor Sherbak, head of the 6th Directorate of the KGB. But this is very suspicious. For one, the cause of the explosion had effectively been established by April 28th at the earliest, and the role of the KGB was to determine if sabotage played a role. Given that the fault was established to be in the reactor at this point and had been known for several months, what data would they have gathered? Secondly, why would they need to tow it, given it was so far from the nuclear power plant at this point? It was already on the industrial site more than 200 meters from Unit 4, which was much safer than where it initially was, and removing it from the location from where data could already be analyzed would only serve to spread the contamination they're claiming they want to prevent. This opens up a distinct possibility that the Mercedes was stolen from Chernobyl by the KGB for an undisclosed use. Keep in mind that it had a very powerful computer on board, as well as Western technology that was extremely expensive and relatively unused, given the Mercedes was about 4 to 6 months old. As for the vehicle itself, who knows? It could have been spared and sent around the Soviet Union for new unknown purposes or scrapped for being useless to its new owners. In the battle between the Chernobyl disaster and the Mercedes Benz truck, two opposites in technology, a several thousand-ton nuclear reactor and a light mobile vehicle, the vehicle survived the wrath of the inferno, only to succumb instead to man, be it refusal to attempt to save it or for nefarious uses by the KGB. We will never know, but the little details and the untold stories live on in those who want to tell it and to preserve the history of those who were involved in it. In memory of Vladimir Sov and Georgy Popov.